Here's something most people never stop to think about. Every single chicken that ends up on your dinner table came from a mother and a father, just like any other animal. But walk into a supermarket and look at a carton of eggs, and you'll never see a single brother anywhere in that store. Hens lay the eggs. Roosters don't. And that one simple fact opens up a much stranger question than it seems. A commercial egg operation needs hens, and only hens, to keep the eggs coming. But nature doesn't work that neatly. Roughly half of every batch of chicks that hatches is male. So somewhere, on a massive scale, an entire population of male birds has to go somewhere. Are they raised for meat? Are they kept as breeding roosters? Do they simply vanish from the system? And maybe the bigger question is this. Why did an entire global industry end up built around one sex of a single species, while the other sex became, in economic terms, almost worthless? To understand that, you have to start with one small biological fact and follow it all the way to its consequences, because that one fact reshaped an entire industry. Let's clear something up first. Male chickens are not inedible. There is nothing dangerous, toxic, or unpleasant about rooster meat that would stop anyone from eating it. Humans have been eating roosters for thousands of years, long before anyone had ever heard the word hatchery. So the real question isn't whether male chickens can be eaten. It's why they aren't raised commercially the same way dedicated meat chickens are. And that answer, like so many answers in modern agriculture, comes down to cold economics. Here's the part that surprises a lot of people. The chicken that shows up on your plate and the chicken that laid the egg on your breakfast table are, in a very real sense, not the same animal anymore. Over the last several decades, humans have split the chicken into two separate biological products. One branch was bred purely to lay eggs. The other was bred purely to grow meat and grow it fast. They're still technically the same species, but their bodies, their growth rates, their entire purpose has been pulled in two completely different directions. Start with the egg-laying side. A modern commercial hen is an extraordinary piece of biological engineering, refined generation after generation until she can produce something like 300 eggs a year, almost one a day. That's an astonishing rate for any animal. But there's an obvious catch buried in that achievement. A rooster, no matter how well bred, cannot lay a single egg. Ever. That sounds almost too obvious to mention, but think about what it actually means for a hatchery running at industrial scale. Every single male chick that comes out of that incubator is, from the business's perspective, an animal that will never generate the product the entire operation exists to produce. Feed him for months, and you're spending real money on an animal that will never lay an egg. And then there's a second problem stacked on top of the first. Male chicks from egg-laying breeds aren't particularly good at growing meat either. They tend to be leaner, smaller framed, slower growing, and far less efficient at converting feed into muscle than a bird bred specifically for meat production. Meanwhile, on the other side of the industry, broiler chickens, the breed raised specifically for meat, have been selectively bred for one overriding trait: growth speed. A modern broiler can reach market weight in something like 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, from hatching to harvest. An egg-laying breed was never built for that kind of growth curve. It was built to lay, not to bulk up quickly. So taking its male offspring and trying to raise them as meat birds tends to be a losing proposition financially, at least at industrial scale. And this is where the modern poultry industry made a very deliberate, very calculated decision. Instead of trying to breed one all-purpose chicken that could do everything reasonably well, the industry split into specialists. One line of birds exists to lay eggs. A completely separate line exists to grow meat. It's not that different from how a factory works. You could design one flexible machine that does 10 different jobs adequately, or you could build 10 separate machines, each one optimized for a single task and nothing else. In almost every case, the second approach wins on efficiency, and that's essentially what happened to the chicken. So when a hatchery is producing egg-laying hens, the male chicks that come along with them aren't really the product. They're closer to a byproduct, an unavoidable side effect of producing enough females. It wasn't always this extreme. Go back a century or two to small family farms, and the picture looked completely different. A farmer might keep a single rooster for every 8 or 10 hens, mostly for breeding and for guarding the flock. Extra males beyond that could be raised and eaten without much trouble, because the scale was small, and the roosters had other uses too. But once egg production moved into massive centralized hatcheries, producing tens of thousands, sometimes millions, of chicks a week, that old small farm logic collapsed. There simply isn't room or profit in keeping that many roosters around. So the industry was left with an uncomfortable question. What do you actually do with all these male chicks you don't need? And historically, one answer became disturbingly common. Shortly after hatching, male chicks from egg-laying breeds were culled. This practice, often called male chick culling, has become one of the most controversial and criticized aspects of modern egg production. It isn't that male chickens are somehow useless as animals. It's that the economic structure of the industry made them extremely difficult to use profitably at scale. But over the past decade or so, science has been racing to find a way around this problem entirely. And the idea driving that research is almost elegant in its simplicity. What if you could figure out the sex of a chick while it's still inside the egg, before it even hatches? If you could do that reliably, you'd never need to hatch, raise, or cull a male chick in the first place. This approach is known as in-ovo sexing, and several different methods have been developed to make it work. Some techniques analyze tiny hormonal markers in the fluid of the egg. Others use spectroscopy to detect subtle chemical differences associated with sex. Some newer methods even use high-resolution imaging or AI-assisted scanning to spot developing feather patterns or reproductive structures days before hatching. If the scan detects a male embryo, that egg can be removed from the incubation process early, often before the point where most researchers believe the embryo can feel pain. If it's female, it continues developing normally into a future laying hen. Several countries, including Germany and France, have already begun restricting or banning traditional chick culling in favor of these in-ovo technologies, and other nations are watching closely to see how the transition plays out at commercial scale. But there's also a much older, much simpler alternative that humans have used for thousands of years. Just eat the males. And plenty of cultures still do exactly that. In many parts of the world, older roosters are prized specifically for slow cooking. Their meat tends to be tougher and more densely flavored because these birds are older and far more active than a typical broiler. But that toughness isn't a flaw so much as a different cooking challenge. Slow braises, rich broths, long simmered stews. There's an entire culinary tradition in places like France and parts of Asia built specifically around older rooster meat, sometimes called coq in French cuisine, where the tougher texture is turned into something deeply flavorful through hours of gentle cooking. Historically, some cultures even developed the practice of castrating young roosters, producing what's known as a capon, an animal that grows larger and develops notably tender, richly flavored meat as a delicacy. So the culinary knowledge for using male chickens has existed for a very long time. What changed wasn't the edibility of the meat. What changed was the economics of raising it at industrial scale. Because if you're running a massive commercial operation built around producing cheap chicken meat as efficiently as possible, an egg breed male simply isn't the right tool for the job. You want a dedicated broiler, an animal engineered from the ground up for rapid, efficient growth. The broiler industry has spent something like 70 or 80 years refining exactly that trait through generations of selective breeding. So the chicken breast you buy at the supermarket almost certainly did not come from a rooster hatched on an egg farm. It came from a specialized meat bird, bred for that single purpose from day one. Now here's a detail that puts the whole situation in a different light. Chickens were not originally domesticated primarily for meat. Historians and archaeologists generally agree that the earliest domesticated chickens, believed to descend from the red jungle fowl of Southeast Asia, were valued for a whole mix of reasons. Eggs, yes, but also meat, feathers, ceremonial and religious significance, and perhaps most surprisingly, fighting. In many ancient societies, roosters weren't seen primarily as food at all. They were admired, even revered. Their crowing marked the start of the day. Their aggression and dominance in the flock became symbolically tied to courage, status, and masculinity in human culture. Cockfighting spread across dozens of civilizations, from ancient Persia to Rome to Southeast Asia, and in some of those societies, a prized fighting rooster could be worth far more than any hen. So historically, male chickens were anything but worthless. Quite the opposite. The shift happened when agriculture industrialized. Once poultry farming moved from small flocks in a farmyard to operations producing hundreds of millions and eventually billions of birds a year, every animal that didn't directly contribute to output became a cost line on a spreadsheet. Feed, water, housing space, heating, labor, transportation, all of it adds up fast at that scale. And a male chick from an egg-laying breed checks almost none of the boxes that matter economically. He can't lay eggs, and he isn't an efficient meat animal either. So the industry ended up asking a brutally simple question. What is the cheapest, most efficient way to produce only the female chickens we actually need? And the search for an answer to that question created one of the strangest and most ethically debated situations in modern agriculture. A perfectly healthy, perfectly normal animal rendered almost worthless purely because of which sex it happened to be born. And it's worth being honest about something here. That's not biology making that determination. That's the production system humans designed around the biology. It's a distinction worth sitting with for a second. This isn't actually unique to chickens either, if you zoom out. The dairy industry runs into a strikingly similar problem with male calves. A dairy cow only produces milk after giving birth, which means roughly half of the calves born on a dairy farm are male, and male calves don't produce milk any more than a rooster lays eggs. Many end up raised for veal or beef instead, a different but structurally similar economic sorting problem. Humans have engineered this kind of sex-based specialization into more than one branch of animal agriculture, not just poultry. It's a pattern that shows up whenever an industry breeds animals intensely for one narrow biological output. And that points to something bigger about how humans interact with the species we've domesticated. We don't just tame animals and leave their biology alone. We reshape them, generation after generation, selecting for the traits that serve our purposes and breeding those traits again and again until the animal itself is transformed. Wild aurochs became dairy cattle capable of producing gallons of milk a day, far beyond anything their wild ancestors could manage. Wolves became everything from tiny lapdogs to massive livestock guardians. And the humble red junglefowl became, in parallel, an egg-laying machine on one branch and a rapid-growth meat machine on another. Somewhere in the space between those two specialized branches, the male offspring of the egg-laying line became a genuine problem that the system had never fully solved. So, why don't we eat male chickens the way we eat other meat animals? The honest answer is, sometimes we do. Rooster meat still shows up in kitchens and markets around the world, especially in older culinary traditions built around slow cooking. But within modern industrial egg production specifically, most male chicks aren't raised for meat because they come from breeds optimized entirely for laying eggs rather than for packing on meat efficiently. The egg industry has no use for them as egg producers, and raising them as meat birds is, in almost every case, significantly less profitable than simply raising dedicated broiler chickens instead. So male chickens didn't disappear from our plates because their meat is somehow inferior or inedible. They became rare in commercial food systems because humans optimized the entire structure of that system around efficiency, and efficiency, in this case, had a very particular, very uncomfortable cost. It also helps to understand just how enormous this problem is in raw numbers. Globally, the egg industry hatches somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 billion chicks every single year just to maintain laying flocks, and roughly half of those, several billion birds annually, are male. That scale is almost impossible to picture. It's not a handful of farms dealing with a side issue. It's one of the largest, quietest byproducts of the entire global food system, happening every day in hatcheries most consumers will never see or think about. Public awareness of this issue has grown a lot in the last decade, partly because of animal welfare organizations publicizing the practice, and partly because of genuine scientific progress on alternatives. Some grocery chains in Europe have already started selling eggs labeled specifically as coming from operations that use in-ovo sexing instead of culling, essentially letting consumers pay a small premium to support the newer technology. It's a similar dynamic to cage-free or free-range labeling a decade earlier, a market-driven push alongside regulatory pressure. Whether that model spreads globally or stays limited to a handful of wealthier markets that can absorb the extra cost is still an open question. There's also a quieter, less discussed option that some smaller farms and breeders have leaned into: dual-purpose breeds. These are older heritage chicken breeds that were never pushed to the biological extremes of modern commercial layers or broilers. They don't lay quite as many eggs as a specialized hen, and they don't grow quite as fast as a specialized broiler. But both males and females of these breeds can be raised productively for eggs and for meat. It's essentially the pre-industrial solution making a small comeback, mostly among small-scale and pasture-raised operations, because it sidesteps the male chick problem almost entirely. The trade-off is cost. Dual-purpose birds simply can't compete with the sheer output efficiency of specialized industrial breeds, which is exactly why they were pushed to the margins of the industry in the first place. Looking further ahead, there's genuinely interesting research happening around gene editing techniques that could, in theory, cause only female embryos to develop from certain genetic lines, essentially preventing male eggs from ever completing incubation. There's also slow but steady progress in lab-grown or cultivated meat, which some researchers argue could eventually reduce pressure on this part of the supply chain entirely by decoupling meat production from live animal breeding altogether. Neither of these is close to replacing the current system at global scale yet, but both represent real attempts to solve a problem that, for most of the 20th century, the industry simply didn't try to solve at all. It's worth stepping back and noticing how unusual this entire situation actually is from a historical perspective. For nearly all of human history, animals were valued as whole individuals, useful for multiple things across their lifetime: milk, labor, meat, materials, companionship. The idea of an animal being sorted at the moment of birth into either valuable or not valuable based on a single trait and having its entire future determined by that one classification is a remarkably modern invention. It's efficient in a narrow economic sense, but it also represents a fairly stark way of thinking about a living creature. And it's part of why this particular issue has become such a flashpoint in broader conversations about industrial animal agriculture, which leaves us with something genuinely strange to think about. The chicken sitting in your refrigerator, the egg in your breakfast, and a rooster crowing on a farm at sunrise might technically be the exact same species. But after literally thousands of years of deliberate human selection, they are no longer doing anything close to the same job in the world. We took one bird, one single species, and split it into an egg-producing machine, a meat-producing machine, a genetic breeding stock, and, in some cultures still, a living alarm clock and symbol of status. And the male chick born into an egg-laying line ended up caught squarely in the middle of a system that humans built almost entirely around the value of his sisters. A system now facing real pressure through new technology, changing consumer expectations, and shifting regulation to finally find a better answer than the one it settled on for so long.